All right, good day, everybody. This is Jason Straight with the Past Cloud Virtual Group. Today, we're here with Sanil Mhatre, and he is going to be presenting text mining and sentiment analysis made easy. Before we get started, though, I do have a few announcements. So our webcast today is being brought to us by Spotlight Cloud by Quest. Spotlight Cloud is the first Azure-hosted database performance monitoring solution focused on SQL Server customers, leveraging the scalability, performance, and built-in security of Microsoft Azure Cosmos DB. Spotlight combines the best of the cloud with Quest's engineering insights from years of building database performance management tools. So if you do have a chance, please go out and check them out. And so with that, I'm going to hand things over to Sanil and his session today, text mining and sentiment analysis made easy.
Thank you, Jason. I just wanted to double check. I have 1 hour for this presentation, right?
That is correct.
Perfect. Could you please give me a 10-minute warning?
Yeah, well, absolutely. We'll do.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. All right. So thank you, everyone, for making time to participate with this webinar. I am going to share the things that I have learned about text mining and sentiment analysis during a course of a project that we did at my company a few months ago. And all of this is based on the real work that we did in my company. The data that you see is obviously de-identified, but the use case, the functionality, the business value of it is all from real-life experience. I am a senior developer working in the field of data analytics for Worldwide Technology. It's a company based in St. Louis, Missouri, and I work remotely from British Columbia, Canada. I used to be a developer, an architect, and I am an amateur data scientist. I have worked with Oracle. I know that's a big no-no when it comes to the past summit, so please don't give me bad reviews just because I have worked on Oracle, but I have. I also worked with MySQL, DB2, MongoDB, Vertica. I have worked on various cloud and big data implementations, and I love speaking, blogging, and volunteering with PAS. So after this introduction, I am going to turn off my webcam. So in case there are any bandwidth issues, we can dedicate the bandwidth to screen sharing. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? We have all heard about quantitative analysis in the world of data analytics. Today, we are going to look at data that doesn't necessarily fit the mold of quantitative analysis. You can't really do aggregate slicing and dicing on that data. How do you work with that data? We have lots of data of that nature in the form of free text from survey results, from social media, document parsing, all kinds of fun stuff. So that's qualitative data, and we are going to try to figure out how can we do some analysis on qualitative data. We are using an employee survey from Acme Corporation to be able to walk through this entire presentation as a real-life use case or an example of a real-life scenario. We will be using Azure's AI and cognitive services. We'll also be using Power BI, and we will be talking about Power BI service if time permits. I will also show a few things using R, and we will try to compare and contrast various approaches using R and Power BI. And lastly, I would like to leave some time for Q&A, hopefully 10 minutes for Q&A. So let's move forward and dive right in. So we have two types of data that we generally do analysis on. The most common type of data that we are all familiar with is quantitative data. As you can see on the right side of your screen, this data is numeric in nature. It can be easily summarized, aggregated, sliced and diced, and you can use a ton of statistical techniques to analyze this data and appropriately draw conclusions. Qualitative data, on the other hand, consists of text, words, narratives. The kind of analysis that you can do on top of it includes keywords, getting hold of general themes or concepts. You can understand perceptions. Examples of this kind of data would be free-form text responses to surveys, transcripts of conversations, social media, tweets, Facebook posts, all kinds of stuff of this nature. In this session, we will be looking at ways to combine these two techniques. Qualitative analysis has its own strengths and quantitative analysis also has its own strengths. So we will be first doing some qualitative analysis on that text data, and then we are going to figure out how can we translate this text data, all of this qualitative data, into some kind of a numeric score on top of which we can do quantitative analysis. And that opens up an entire world of statistical methods that we can apply to it and a brand new area of analysis that can be done on top of it using means, medians, histograms, all kinds of fun stuff that we will dive into pretty shortly. So the use case here is an employee survey from Acme Corporation. There were two questions that were asked for gauging the employee satisfaction or how the health of the employee base in the company is doing. The first question was, is there anything unique about this company that makes it a great place to work? And the second question was, if you could change one thing about this company to make it a better place to work, what would it be? As you might notice, these two questions are kind of polarizing. In the first question, the intent is to elicit a positive response. And in the second question, the intent is to elicit feedback in the form of constructive criticism. These kind of questions are really good examples of a great survey design because they allow you to elicit appropriate responses from your target audience. You are either going to get responses that are on the positive end of the spectrum or on the negative end of the spectrum, and that helps a great deal in staying away from the median, staying away from the mixed responses. In this example, we got 252 replies back. If you combine all of those replies and put them into a Word document, there were 995 lines of text and about 12,400 words. So I'm going to show you real quick how does this look like in an Excel document. So there are two questions, question ID 1 and question ID 2, and then we have a large number of responses, 251 to be exact, and I have question ID over here, response ID, and the response text listed out. Now, before I jump into actually analyzing this data, I wanted to give a very high-level overview of the Azure portal and the AI and cognitive services. So if you go to Azure Cognitive Services, Text Analytics, on this page, you can see a portion where you can play around with the API and get a hold of the responses. So in this text box, you can type any text and it will give you the response of the API for this text. So something like, these puppies are really cute. Let's see what the API does on this. You would expect a positive response, and that's what you get. You get a 93% positive sentiment score on this text. It is identifying the key phrase as puppies, and it has automatically detected the language as English with 100% confidence. Just to see what a negative response looks like, we are going to put in a sentence, this coffee was really cold and stale. This might be a Yelp review or a part of a Yelp review. So as expected, the sentiment score is just 2% positive. That means this sentence has a really negative connotation. The key phrases are coffee and stale, and it has automatically detected English as the language. I am a big fan of Loghorn Foghorn's phrases. So sometimes I like to see how the sentiment analysis API responds to those. And it's fun to see how this guy does with a phrase, the dog's as subtle as a hand grenade in a barrel of oatmeal. So let's see what happens here. It's 50%. So the API doesn't really detect if the sentiment here is positive or negative. So it gives us a 50% score right in the middle of the whole spectrum. The next one I like to show because 2 years ago when I first developed this talk and I discovered this, what do you call it? See this API in action kind of a screen. I supplied this phrase in, and this phrase returned a sentiment of 50%. So over time, I see that the API has gotten smarter. They use a ton of machine learning algorithms, and they continuously train their APIs on the back end based on the data that has been fed to it. And now, 2 years later, this same sentence returns a sentiment score of 76%, just leaning towards positive and not the 50% score that it used to return about 2 years ago. So it's just interesting to see how the power of Azure and machine learning is being utilized to continuously tune the output of this API. All right, so now that we have seen an example of how this API works in just a demo or a sampling kind of a world, I wanted to just dive into the Azure portal and show you how you can go about creating your own cognitive services API endpoints. So you go into the top left-hand side of your screen, create a resource, and depending on your connection speed and such, it might take a few seconds to show up. You go into AI and machine learning and text analytics. Once you click on text analytics, it's going to ask you a bunch of wizard kind of questions where you go about creating your API endpoint. Once you go through these steps, you are going to come across something that looks like the API that I have created. There are two things that you would want to note about this API. One is the keys. This API is not authenticated with username password, so anytime you would like to call this API, you have to supply these keys. So remember, once you create your API, make a note of these keys. If you feel at any time that these keys have been compromised, you can always go into the Azure portal and generate new keys. at which time you're going to have to go back into your application and replace the keys. The second thing to note is the API endpoint. This guy is in the West US zone. Microsoft is working on making this cognitive services available across all of their availability zones. About 2 years ago, this cognitive services API was only available in the US, and now it's available in more regions all over the world. I think we are at a point where it is probably available in pretty much all of the Azure regions all over the world. But before you start using this, just make sure that it's available in your region. So creating your cognitive services is as simple as just going through the wizard and then grabbing your keys and making sure that you have grabbed your API endpoint as well. You're going to use this when you invoke this API from a Power BI function. So let's move on to that piece. We went through this. We took the API for a spin as well. Power BI. All right. So I am a regular user of Tableau as well as Power BI. So I try to treat both Power BI and Tableau like they are my children, and there are no favorites between the two. But there are some things with Power BI that I like more about, and there are other things with Tableau that I like more about. But when it comes to working with Azure APIs, Power BI makes your life super, super easy. So I am assuming basic familiarity with Power BI, and we will move forward from there. So here you are seeing a dashboard that I have already created. I'm not going to go through all of the steps to create this dashboard because running through this in real life takes some time. The API does take more than a few minutes to return responses for all of the text that you wanted to analyze. So we'll work through this, and I'm just going to show you at a very high level what I have done to import this data. So in Power BI, on the top ribbon, you can click on Get Data, click on Excel, and from this screen, you point to the Excel document and import that Excel document. So once you have imported that Excel document, it is going to pull up a screen where it parses through your Excel document, and it automatically identifies the fact that your Excel has two tabs, one for question and one for responses. It will automatically create those two tables for you in Power BI semantic layer. And you notice here that I did not really have to tell Power BI that there is a relationship between these two tables. It automatically detects the relationship as well. So the three columns that we imported from our file are question ID, response ID, and response text. The next three columns, key phrases, sentiment score, and sentiment score bins, is something that came out of the response of the API. So we are now going to dig into how do you get the response out of the API. All right, so to be able to create Power BI functions, you need to go into Edit Queries. And over here, I have created two functions. One, to get hold of the key phrase response from the API, and the second one, to get hold of the sentiment score from the API. These functions are pretty straightforward, and they are available on a blog from the Power BI team. I also have them in the resources linked attached at the end of my slide deck that I'll share after this session. But this is what the function looks like. It's going to ask you to enter the API key. So where you see API key over here, this is my API key. And when you are invoking your API, make sure you enter your own API key and your own endpoint. The rest of the function is telling us that we are passing in a text, and the response that is coming back is the key phrases response. On similar lines, we create the sentiment score function. You have your API key, your endpoint, we are passing a text, and we are receiving the sentiment score as the response. Once you create both of these functions, you have to invoke these functions. So while you are in the query editor, you can go into the Add Column ribbon and then click on Invoke Custom Functions in the button. Now, when you click on Invoke Functions, it's going to ask you the name of the column that you would want the output of the function to go to. In this case, it is key phrases. Next, it is going to ask you to pick the function name from a drop-down list. And the last thing that it is going to ask you is which column do you want to feed into this function as an input. In this case, it's the response text itself, the raw text. On similar lines, you are going to, let's see if I have those screenshots over here as well. Yep, on exactly similar lines, you are going to invoke the sentiment score function as well. You want the response of the sentiment score function to go into a new column called sentiment score. The function that you are going to invoke is the sentiment score function, and the input that you are going to pass into it, once again, is the response text. I have a few screenshots here to help with any potential errors that you might get with security settings. So if you do run into any errors related to security settings, which are quite common, make sure that you go into your data source settings, and for each and every item listed in this data source setting, change the settings, edit the permission levels to public. This is just to make sure that Power BI has access to the file that is sitting on your desktop. And then for the API calls itself, change the credential type to anonymous. What this means is you are not going to pass in a username and password to invoke the API. You are passing in the API key. Once all of these things about invoking the functions has been set up, then you can go back to your home tab. It's back here. You can go into the Power BI dashboard. And then you can go into the dashboard. And then you can and click close and apply. In this case, I am not going to click close and apply because if I do that, it's going to ping the API. All of my 250 odd lines are going to be sent to the Azure API and it's going to spin for a few minutes waiting for the response. So I am simply going to close this out. So assume that we have flown through time, all of the processing has happened, and now you get two columns back, key phrases and sentiment scores. I will talk about the sentiment score bins at an appropriate time a few minutes later. But this is now, these 5 columns are now the data that you can start working with, and you can start analyzing all of this data. My apologies. Could you please let me know where exactly you lost connection so I can resume from that point?
Sure, it was about 2 to 3 minutes ago. So
Okay, so did
we're
you guys see where I talked about invoking the functions?
I think that's a good spot to restart from.
Okay, all right. My apologies about that. I tried to make sure that the connection is stable. I restarted my browser, but sorry, I restarted my router as well before the session, but these things happen. My apologies, and thank you so much for bearing with me. So let's restart from the point where we talked about invoking the custom functions. So we created these 2 functions, one for key phrases and the other for sentiment scores, and we are invoking them in such a way that we want their output to go into brand new columns. So one of them is key phrases and the other one is sentiment score. I am showing on my screen the sentiment score piece of invoking the function. So on this screen, you can see that you are trying to make the output go into a new column called sentiment score. The function that you're invoking is the sentiment score function you created some time ago, and the input to this function is the text response. Once you are done invoking these functions, setting all of this up, at that point you would want to hit sorry, I am going to go into the Edit Queries screen one more time to show the Close and Apply button. You have 2 functions created. You have them set up to be invoked in the appropriate way. And now after all of this setting is done, the actual invocation of the functions is done when you click the Close and Apply button. So in this case, I am only going to hit the close button because if I do close and apply, it's going to spin for a few minutes by trying to actually ping the API. So let me hit the close button here. Once the close button has been hit, you will get data inside of the key phrases column as well as the sentiment score column. The sentiment score bin column is a calculated field that I created to help with the histogram visualization, and we'll talk about it as we get into the histogram itself. All right, so let's get back to, oops, I wanted to close this. Oh, no, I do not want to close Power BI. I wanted to go back to this page. All right, so you now have your qualitative analysis in the form of the key phrases that you extracted from all of your text, and you also have the starting point of your quantitative analysis, which was the sentiment score that you generated from passing the text to the API. The API receives this text line by line, and it sends the response back line by line as well. So you now have 252 rows of responses that now have the appropriate values in the key phrase column as well as the sentiment score column. Jumping into the visualization part of it, it's generally a good practice to go top, bottom, left, right in terms of the granularity of the information that you are presenting. So on the top, you would want to tell your user, your consumer, a very high-level summary. So we start off by making the user familiar with the questions that this survey is trying to analyze. There are 2 questions, there were 252 responses. Then we jump into the qualitative analysis where we create a word cloud. Power BI makes your life super easy when it comes to creating a word cloud. There is a word cloud visualization readily available. If you don't already have this downloaded and installed, you can click on Import Custom Visualization and import it from the marketplace. Power BI visualizations, as far as importing them from the marketplace is concerned, is more like buyer beware. So make sure you look at the ratings, make sure you look at some of the feedback before you import these visualizations. You want to make sure that you are not installing malicious code on your machine from anywhere. It just makes good common sense to do that kind of due diligence. That being said, the word cloud visualization is fairly robust, stable, and rock solid. It's used pretty widely and has really high reviews. So you import this visualization, and now all you need to do to be able to make good use of this visualization is open up the responses and then drag and drop your key phrases into the word cloud visualization. And this is going to do the magic of breaking down your key phrases into its individual words. It has the appropriate list of stop words as well. So things like a, and, the, all of those prepositions, all of the words that don't really add any meaning, they are automatically going to get filtered out, and it's going to do a count on the number of times a particular word appears. And the visualization shows the words that occur more frequently in a bigger font size and the words that occur less frequently in a smaller font size. The color is randomly selected based on the color scheme that you pick. There isn't really any meaning to be derived from the color. Red does not mean necessarily bad. Green does not necessarily mean good. It's just a color scheme. A couple of things that you would want to know about this visualization is where you can go in to make some tweaks, to do some tuning. So you can go into the format and you can pick and choose colors that you would like. Note here stop words. I have turned the stop words on, and what this does is the default stop list where it eliminates words that don't really have any meaning is taking effect. If I turn it off, you see the word cloud changes and it gets a tad bit more busier. Words with no meaning like off appear 71 times when I turn off the stop words. But when you turn on the stop words, those meaningless words go away. So that's something you would want to remember. There are a few more customizations that you can do. Here you can have a comma-separated list of custom stop words. So if I did not care about the word Acme, I could add Acme over here. And Acme would now vanish from the word cloud. So it's a good way to tune your word cloud, eliminate the words that you don't care about. There are some other visualizations that you can do. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. Over here, you can control the minimum threshold of frequency for the words to appear in the word cloud. I have the threshold set to 10 over here, and I just wanted to show you what happens if I change the threshold to 2. So as you can see, the word cloud is now super busy, and it's really difficult to detect what might be trends or commonly occurring themes when your word cloud is really busy. So this is something that you have to play around with, and it's a trial and error. I found that for this particular word cloud, I only cared about words that appear at least 10 times or more. You can also set the maximum number of words, so feel free to play around with those customizations. Next, I'm going to go into the Details tab where we use median, box plot, and histograms to be able to make some sense out of the quantitative data. On the first page, we did some qualitative analysis, so now it's time to do some quantitative analysis. Over here, I have a page filter, so you can get these responses filtered by one or the other question or an aggregate of both. I'm seeing an aggregate over here, and over in this gauge, I wanted to show the average sentiment score across both the questions. This shows that it is 65% positive. If you only select the second question, which was is there anything unique or unusual about this company that makes it a great place to work? You see that the sentiment is 77% positive. That makes sense because naturally the response to this kind of a question is more positive. The second visualization that we wanted to see is the box plot. And without going too deep into the statistics behind the box plot, there are two things that you would want to focus on the box plot. First is the height of the box. The height of the box is indicative of the variance in the scores, meaning if the box is really, really narrow, that means all of the scores were aligned either positively or negatively, doesn't matter, but they were more aligned. Say you got 10 responses, everyone was happy, then the box will be super narrow and towards the higher end of the y-axis. And if everyone was super unhappy, the box would still be super narrow and it would be at the lower end. On the other hand, if you got 10 responses and let's say 3 people were really happy, 3 people were super unhappy, and 4 of the responses had mixed feelings, then you would get a box that is really wide along the y-axis. It's super tall. That means the scores of the responses are spread all across the spectrum. They're all over the place. They are not necessarily aligned positively or negatively. So in this case, we see that the first question, if you could change one thing about the company, what would it be? Your box is kind of broad, so we can see that the responses are spread all over the board. And for the second one, you can see that the box is broader, but it is on the higher side of the y-axis, meaning that the responses are spread more towards the positive end of the spectrum. This interpretation is further substantiated by a histogram. And the histogram is where we'll talk about binning. So your sentiment scores are going from 0 to 1 in increments of 0.01. When your sentiment scores are so finely grained, it's really difficult to build a histogram that makes sense. A histogram makes a lot of sense when it has predefined steps and the number of steps are manageable. So to create manageable steps, we are going to bin the sentiment scores. So to bin a sentiment score, you simply click on the ellipsis next to it, click New Group, and it will open up a screen that will ask you to create a group. In this case, I am creating a group for bins. My minimum value is 0.01, maximum value is 1, and I'll change the bin size to 0.1 so I get nice steps that go in increments of 0.1. So you use the bin sentiment score column to create your next visualization, which is the histogram. In this histogram, you can see there are higher bars on the more positive end of the spectrum. So scores towards 0.8, 0.9 have higher bars, and that reaffirms our interpretation from the box plot that the response to this question is more in the positive range of the world. If you were to look at the same thing for the previous question, if you could change one thing about this company to make it better, what would it be? This question can evoke negative feedback. So the average score for this question's response is lower in the positivity of the sentiment, which can be seen from the gauge itself. We are now at 0.53 versus previously we were at 0.77. In terms of the box plot, the box shape is narrower and the location of the box is lower on the y-axis. The histogram, the distribution is bimodal distribution. So you see some peaks on the left as well as some peaks on the right, and the middle is kind of sparse. So this is bimodal distribution, and it shows that the responses are pretty polarized. Some people feel strongly positive about this, whereas some people feel strongly negative about this. So this is how you can go from qualitative text to quantitative analysis using the sentiment score that you generated. Now that you have done all of this slicing and dicing, it might be a good idea for someone to actually look into each and every individual response. So that's when we go into the next tab on this dashboard, where you allow people to see the individual responses, and you allow them to consume these in a manner where it doesn't feel like they're drinking out of a fire hose. So here we have two filters. The first filter allows the user to pick a question, and the second filter is on the score bins. So if a user wanted to focus on the most negative responses or the most positive responses, you're allowing them the options to do so. So in this case, say I was in the HR department and I was having a really tough day, so I wanted a feel-good thing. So I want to read all of the positive feedback. So let me just click on the score bin of 1, and it's going to tell us the most positive responses is going to show me the most positive responses, the ones that have scores in the range of 0.9 to 1, extremely positive. And those responses are good culture. The second one is great benefits. Team culture is really good. And micromanaging. So the API here is smart enough to detect that what the user meant was there is no micromanaging, and that is why the team culture is really good. It's smart at extrapolating a few things as well. If I only wanted to look at the most negative things, I could pick the score of 0.1 and the question, if you could change one thing about the company, what would it be? And that will allow you to see the most negative responses. And I will not bore you with the actual responses themselves.
Sunil, it is 10 minutes to.
Thank you, Jason. I have a couple of things more to show you guys. So I will wrap those up in 2 minutes and then open up for Q&A. All right, so what do you do if you don't have access to Power BI and Azure? The problem about no access to Power BI can be easily solved because Power BI Desktop is free for you to download and use. If you don't have access to Azure, yes, it's much more difficult of a barrier to overcome, but R is free to download and use, and you can do all of these analysis in R as well. The scripts that I'm using will be available for sharing. The link will be in my slide deck. So I won't go through all of these scripts, but I wanted to show you that a word cloud can be created in R pretty easily. You can get the sentiment scores out of a script in R pretty easily as well. What I wanted to show, that's something unique that you can do in R, and I haven't found a way to do this in Azure and Power BI, is the emotional classification. There is an interesting concept about the fact that there are 7 basic human emotions, and I found a package called Shoots, which identifies the presence of these 7 basic human emotions in the text that you wanted to analyze. So this graph here is telling me that amongst all of the text that was analyzed, about 35% of the times the human emotion of trust was detected, and on the negative end of the spectrum, about 2.5% of the times a human emotion of disgust was detected. How you would interpret this is based on the context, but I thought this was a really interesting way to analyze data as well. And this is more on the qualitative side rather than the quantitative side, but it's really interesting and insightful nonetheless. The last thing I wanted to show was correlation, and I will not go into too much detail, but over here in R you can find associated terms. So what I am doing here is asking R that I have this word culture and I want to find what other words are associated with culture in the text that we analyzed, and they show up at least 60% of the times or more, and that's the correlation limit of 0.6. And now it's telling me all of the other words that occurred with culture at least 60% of the times or more. You can do this as ad hoc analysis. You can plug and play a bunch of words in this and keep exploring one step further down to arrive at something that you might be looking for, or if you want to do an overall high-level analysis, you might want to create a heat map that shows you the level of correlation between various words. So just some ideas to take this further in R if you were possibly interested in doing that. So that is pretty much everything that I had to show. Pretty much all of the slides are talking about the same stuff that we looked through in the demo. And the resources page here is going to have links to everything, including the scripts in GitHub that we use to create all of these analysis. So we have about 5 minutes. So I'm going to go into the chat window and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, Sunil, so far there are no questions. There is one comment saying that be sure to reset your API keys after the presentation.
Oh yes, thank you. I always do that after every presentation. So yes, thank you. I really appreciate the concern, and it must be
there's
an
one
IT security person. Awesome.
Oh, I'm sure. And then there was a request for the slide deck, but we had talked about that earlier, and you'll get that over to me, and I'll get that published up to the meeting archive page on cloud.pass.org.
Well, awesome. In that case, thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share some of the work that I did that I found interesting, our business users found to be of value, and I hope that you find this of value and something that you can immediately apply to in your respective environments as well. Please feel free to give me any feedback. I am a relatively new speaker, and I always appreciate constructive criticism and feedback.
All right, excellent, and thank you for presenting today. This is excellent. This is very good. I'm going to close things out today. Remind everyone that we do have a presentation coming up this Thursday, actually every Tuesday, Thursday for the next few weeks. So thank you again for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending, and good day.
Thank you. Bye.